What up, Coordination? On the pod today, we are talking about a more cooperative Web3. So basically, what is the intersection of co-ops and mutualism with Web3 technology? So there's a really amazing paper that was just written on this topic, and we've got some of the authors on the paper. So George Oates, who is at the Flickr Foundation, Maxwell Kanter, a contributor at Gitcoin, Sarah Hubbard, who is a public purpose fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Ethics. And so basically, these are three authors that worked on a paper called Towards a More Cooperative Web3. And we are talking about co-ops and DAOs on this episode. I think a really important subject as we try to figure out what DAOs are is discussing what the cooperative movement and DAOs have in common. So the values of mutualism, the values of stakeholders over shareholders could be an important theme here. And this paper in which this design space is explored, I think, is really an important foundational piece for exploring what more cooperative DAOs looks like. So George and Maxwell and Sarah are on the pod, but I just want to give a shout out to the other authors, Avni Patel-Thompson, Ethan Wynn, George Oates, Jad Esper, Legion, Maxwell Kanter, Morshed Manin. I'm doing my best with your names. I hope I'm pronouncing them okay. Philemon Hoax, Sarah Hubbard, Scott Moore, Steven Delavics, Trevor Scholes, and QZ Hum are all authors on this paper. So a broad swath of Web3 people have worked on this paper, and we've just got George and Maxwell and Sarah here to talk about a more cooperative Web3. I think it's one of my favorite episodes that we've done so far, and you're really going to enjoy it. Without further ado, let's get into co-ops and Web3. Enjoy it.
Working in Web3 is awesome, but working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best, their work. Tax time is coming up. OPOLIS helps professionalize your business by helping you form an entity, generate proof of employment through pay stubs, and receive a W-2 at the end of the tax year. Are you self-employed and forced to spend money on expensive healthcare insurance with limited coverage? OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. And finally, OPOLIS's member owners share in OPOLIS's success and profits based on their work token holdings. You must be authorized to work inside the United States and select Canadian provinces to receive OPOLIS's benefits. Book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS's experts and join OPOLIS by March 31st, 2023 to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. And if you're going to ETH Denver, make sure to stop by the OPOLIS booth or attend their Future of Work Summit hosted by OPOLIS. The Glow dollar is a new stablecoin with a very special property. As the market cap of Glow goes up, extreme poverty goes down. Glow is a dollar-backed, non-profit stablecoin that creates basic income for people living in extreme poverty. Glow is basically the same business model as USDC, with yield-generating treasuries on one side and a stablecoin on Ethereum on the other. But instead of being a for-profit company, Glow is a non-profit that donates 100% of all yields from the Glow Reserve to Give Directly's basic income program. Give Directly is a charity that gives people money, no strings attached, to people living in poverty, and is a charity that Vitalik has previously donated to and supported in the past. With Glow, you can reduce poverty just by holding a stablecoin. Glow is launching in early 2023, and you can join the waitlist at glowdollar.org/greenpill. That's glodollar.org/greenpill.
What's up, y'all? So excited to talk about this paper.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So maybe let's start off with a round of intros. Maxwell, you want to go first?
Yeah, definitely. Great to be here. Thanks for having us, Kevin. My name's Maxwell, currently a full-time contributor at the Gitcoin DAO in the public goods funding workstream, where I'm focused mostly on kind of operations and supporting public goods funding.
All right.
Perfect.
Sarah, you want to go next?
Yeah, sounds good. My name is Sarah Hubbard. I'm a product manager, but I'm spending the year doing some academic fellowships where I am focused on researching DAOs and Web3 policy.
Great. Go ahead, George.
Thanks. Happy to be here. My name's George Oates. I'm a designer, software designer, but I'm the newly minted director of the 501c3 Flickr Foundation, flickr.org. Happy to be here.
Great. So the paper has many co-writers, and I'll make sure that they get linked and credited in the show notes and into the show bumper as well. I really want to dive in on this paper that y'all published entitled "Towards a More Cooperative Web3." So, why did you publish the paper, and what is the subject of the paper?
Yeah, I'll give a bit of an overview. So I guess first we'll have to give a big shout out to Jad Esper, because
Yes.
he really helped bring this whole group of different people together and organized a bunch of the discussions and all the co-authoring together. But basically, it's a group of people who are all really interested in DAOs and cooperatives and moving towards a more cooperative Web3. And in general, the paper, it focuses on three main things. So the first is we start off with this brief history of cooperatives and the decentralized web and how DAOs have a very analogous ethos. And then second, we kind of go into, okay, now what can DAOs learn from cooperatives and the very rich history of cooperatives and the collective movement. And then vice versa, how can cooperatives benefit from a lot of what DAOs are building and experimenting with? And then, yeah, lastly, and mostly just this call to action that Web3 should lean into more of this cooperative approach and potential for positive impact, and that there's probably a lot of common solutions to be built for both of these groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we can just take a step back and define what a cooperative is. I think most of our listeners are familiar with Web3, but when it comes to cooperative, maybe listeners aren't familiar with the cooperative movement and what a modern cooperative looks like. Maybe we could spend some time there.
Yeah, in general, cooperatives have this very rich history. I think in general, I mean, I'm not an expert in the space, and the paper in general gathered an entire group of people with different backgrounds, some who were experts in working with cooperatives. But my understanding is a lot of them emerged after the Industrial Revolution, so mostly in the 1700s, 1800s. And in general, they have this ethos of they're member owned and member operated. And so I think for people who are more DAO native, crypto native, you can see how that's analogous and reflected in a lot of the ethos of DAOs today as well. And in general, there's a lot of pretty popular cooperatives that are still working in practice today, even in the United States. There's ones like Land O'Lakes, there's ones like the Green Bay Packers even, right? I mean, there's a ton of really interesting examples of pretty big names and groups that are still around today that are cooperatives. And I guess I'd also add in general, they're kind of born out of economic need and injustice and necessity. So when they're maybe trying to compete with, huge corporate monopolies, or when a community needs to support themselves, people will band together and form these kind of collective groups.
Right.
Yeah, I think what I
go ahead, Maxwell.
I was going to say what I think I might add to that as well, Sarah, is this idea that co-ops kind of optimize for stakeholders or for shareholders. And I think it's this notion that co-ops are kind of owned by people who are impacted by them. We kind of, for this paper, were particularly interested in platform cooperatives. And this idea of platform cooperatives emerged kind of as an alternative to big tech domination, where there's all these platforms that people use every day that kind of far reach to their lives. But very often these tech platforms are owned by these kind of monarchs and these rent-seeking platforms that don't actually generate any value for the people who create value on these platforms, the users. They extract value from users. And co-ops, and in particular platform cooperatives, is one alternative to that, which we think shares a lot of similarities with DAOs and can be greatly benefited from a lot of the crypto technologies that we spend our good time thinking about.
Yeah, so it seems like cooperatives are kind of a reaction to when you have a corporation, you have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders to maximize value to them. And that means that as a management team, you extract from everyone else. And with cooperatives, this is an alternative that allows you to focus on all stakeholders instead of just shareholders. And that can be powerful when literally what you're building is a network and everyone on earth is affected by what you're doing, putting stakeholders before shareholders. I can also see it being a competitive advantage in a network-based world where you need to assimilate information from the edges instead of just give orders top down. Cooperatives aren't it feels like they're an innovation on a moral vector because you're putting stakeholders over shareholders. But in a networked world, they're almost an innovation on an economic vector, like a competitive advantage to have a networked cooperative. So I think that that's really elegant. And I'm wondering, what are the most promising Web3 platform cooperatives or trends in Web3 that you think resemble the cooperative movement? Where does Web3 filter in here?
Yeah, I think the way that we have kind of thought about this paper is mostly with DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. I think the past few years we've seen a lot of DAOs play out. We've seen DAOs coordinate around tokens. We've seen DAOs coordinate around platforms and build things and fund things together. I think there's a lot of ways in which we see crypto being able to positively impact the co-op movement. I think there's a long history of folks like Trevor Schultz and Nathan Schneider and Ostram who have written and thought a lot about this work in the past. And it seems like there's a few key ways in which crypto can positively impact co-ops. One of them, the more exciting one in my eyes, is this idea of bootstrapping capital. I think we've seen DAOs coordinate around tokens, which is an extremely effective model for being able to create a token and coordinate around it. I think very often co-ops struggle with capital formation, and being able to leverage tokenomics and being able to create community currencies in a way where everyone within the co-op would own these tokens collectively, I think is beginning to be explored vastly within DAOs, but largely kind of not really touched upon in the kind of off-chain, offline co-op world. And I think to me, that feels like a very exciting future step in innovation and what it means to actually co-own things together in a way that is enabled and cryptographically secure.
I was just going to say that sort of came up in the paper, didn't it? Where we touched on the subjects of accountability and sort of equity within DAOs and how distinct that is from operating the more traditional cooperatives. And when I say traditional, I basically just mean sort of offline, where there's humans in some form of worker cooperative, let's say, where they all hang out at the same building or whatever, doing the job. But I like the idea that you might be able to sort of insert capital into a cooperative digital environment. But it's challenging with online commons as well as off, or online cooperatives as well as off, to make sure that sort of capital is distributed equally and managed equitably.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a little bit easier said than done. And I think what would be just phenomenal to see would be much more experimentation around what it means for these co-ops and communities to launch tokens. I think in DAO land, at least, we've seen lots of positive examples where things kind of have run awry. And I think we've learned that there's a lot of complexities around launching tokens and managing treasuries. I think some DAO tooling has allowed us to be able to have more transparency when it comes to funds. Everyone kind of votes on chain, everyone can see the votes, and then that can be executed on chain. I think that, painting with a broad brush here, I think that could largely be applicable to instances of cooperatives where transparency is like a key issue. But yeah, I think another issue is just kind of volatility, and you don't really want your community token to be volatile. And I think where it's just now beginning to kind of come around this turning point in Web3 of, maturity and seeing a lot of these models play out. And I think, down the line, I'm very excited for the experimentation we'll hopefully see around these community tokens that eventually hopefully becomes non-volatile, and these communities can really feel ownership and also reliability right now. Because I think right now, in some ways, lots of crypto tokens and governance tokens aren't as reliable as we think they should be.
I think I'd also add, building off of that, things that I guess co-ops can maybe learn from DAOs and like benefit from DAOs a lot. And some of the experimentation in this space, like you mentioned, capital access and transparency. And I think also this like very like fast setup, right? Like you can really quickly spin up an organization that has members from all over the world, and that offers like a really interesting kind of scale and governance mechanisms that DAOs kind of naturally have and are experimenting with. So there may be some really interesting tools and lessons that cooperatives can use or leverage from what DAOs are doing. I'd also add there's like a policy component to it as well. So one thing that some DAOs have been trying to experiment with is this Colorado limited cooperative associations, right? I don't know, Kevin, if you're super familiar with that, but there's, DAOs that are now kind of using this cooperative law in Colorado as basically a legal wrapper. And that's also really interesting, and then affords them the ability to do things like, engage with real world assets and limit liability and all sorts of different things like this. So that's maybe another really interesting kind of crossover that's been experimented with in right now.
Yeah. If you're watching on video, you might have seen my deer in the headlights look, because I'm in Colorado and hoping I wasn't going to get asked to speak about the Colorado co-op law, but we're going to have John Peller from OPOLIS, who's one of the innovators behind that, on the podcast soon, and we're going to talk about the Colorado co-op law. I think it's really interesting. So, I guess this is really interesting to me because it feels like in Web3, every time we turn around, we see another pump and dump or multi-level marketing or like even outright Ponzi schemes. And just to think about using Web3 for more regenerative means, for more mutualistic means, it to me is really exciting because we can take co-ops and we can make them web scale network co-ops, global co-ops with global ownership. And so I guess I just wonder how do we build a different future for Web3? What would you call a mutualistic Web3?
Yeah, I think this idea of a mutualistic Web3 is something that we were all very excited by and united by as we kind of work through this paper. We are all pretty inspired by the D-Web movement, which predates Web3, which is essentially kind of the movement of Take Back the Web, which is kind of promoting these alternatives to massive platforms, peer-to-peer, sharing, controlling your own data, and being able to publish and access known information. And we think that, the D-Web movement, in many ways, that spirit has carried up to Web3, but there's also been lots of contamination, as you mentioned, Kevin, with a lot of these pump and dumps and Ponzi schemes and capital, very rapid capital formation kind of going awry. I think we see the idea of mutualistic Web3 kind of being an extension of the D-Web movement, but mostly kind of like a current iteration of that, whereby Web3 is able to embrace, acknowledge, and kind of manifest a lot more caring values between people within the space. I think, we all like to think of Web3 as kind of multiplayer mode. And I think this idea of mutualistic Web3 kind of embraces that, the idea that we're all here with each other and for each other and trying to build this better world together. And we hope that, through some of these values, through the cooperative movement and through some of the D-Web values, that we can embrace this mutualistic Web3 and create a better world together, essentially, is, I think, how we might operationalize it. But Sarah, George, anything you want to add to that kind of working definition?
I guess I'd add in the paper too, we talk a lot about both, what we just spoke on, which is, okay, how can cooperatives benefit from some of what DAOs are doing? And this is like, how can DAOs benefit and learn from history? And like, there's a really rich history of cooperatives and of collective movements and collective intelligence. And so really, this is like a call to action to lean into that, because I agree. I think you do see a lot of like signal and noise in the space, right? There's like obviously concerns and a lot of noise around, okay, well, we don't want the tools we're building in Web3 to basically end up like replicating the inequities of Web2, or like replicating plutocracy, or having these, huge controlling interests in each of these DAOs, right? But then what makes us excited and where we think we can head towards is leaning into the kind of better parts of what DAOs offer and what we can learn from in the past to kind of get to this ideal mutualist kind of web.
Anything you want to add, George?
There's one platform that I've seen which I was really impressed by, called Open Collective. It was set up to kind of bear the heavy weight of starting up a kind of off-chain charitable organization. I'm not sure if I'm using off-chain correctly there, but it's basically a platform where the Open Collective group itself can manage all the kind of back office and financial administration that you need when you're trying to be a little charitable group of some kind. So just that in itself, I thought was a very sort of generous position. But also the way they've designed the Open Collective platform itself, you can have funders or recipients of funding. Actual cash moves around the system as well. So it's not sort of, it's perhaps a little bit more accessible in that respect, just because you can sort of see the money, as it were. But also it has sort of collective bargaining and voting kind of baked into the software as well, which I think is also really cool. So if I choose to donate some of my money to a program or a project in the system, I can actually see how my money is being spent. And that doesn't happen very often, I think, at least in my experience, where as a donor, unless I'm donating a lot of money, I'm not really sure where my donation then ends up. So there's a series of really healthy and restorative economic practices that have been established at the code level by this platform, Open Collective. So I think we could all learn from that, just the sort of level of transparency and also the type of support that organization gives to little groups trying to do cool stuff.
And I think in general, the more really powerful examples we have like that of how the tech in Web3 can help power real world things that are impacting people's everyday lives. Like it makes I guess it's easier to communicate with, the general public and with anyone really to help kind of them understand the value of what is happening in this space and the potential that it has. And I think there's a couple of organizations that really highlight those really compelling use cases. And obviously, the more of those we have, the better.
Yeah, I think there's this whole trend around exit to community that Open Collective went through. They started off centralized, and now they're in the process of exiting the founders to the community, which makes them into a platform co-op. And one of the things that I'm interested in is, so platform cooperativism has the two components to it. There's the platform, which is you have like a network based with network effects. These organizations will grow exponentially because their network effects grow. So how do you get it off the ground, but also how do you set it towards a trajectory that's mutualistic over the long term? And exit to community is that mechanism through which Open Collective was able to do that, grow their network effects, but also move towards a more mutualistic cooperative model over time instead of like selling to Google or IPOing or something like that. So it feels like that being a more well-trodden path is really important for building communities and trust. But there's a lot of hairy questions around governance and how you build communities and trust and things in there. And I'm wondering if that's where we want to go next. How do we build communities and trust? How do you do governance in a platform cooperative environment?
We wrote the paper together as a fairly large group, and we'd meet each month and sort of discuss the themes of the day together. And one of the themes that kept coming up, at least for me, was this sort of opposition between exponentially scaling and trust and even mutualism, for that matter. It's so easy for computers to just sort of accelerate and get faster and better and bigger and stuff, but it's really hard for humans to do that. And so, there's a certain point where a human group just breaks because people stop knowing each other. And, like if you imagine all the friends in your social circle, it's probably not that many, as popular as you are. But you can have thousands and, tens of thousands and even millions of people in these DAOs.
Another thing that we talked about quite a bit in the paper is how sometimes it's not always technology problems. It always comes back to be like people problems at the end of the day. And so we did talk a lot and how actually that was a very area that could use some common solutions, right? Like DAOs don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel in some regards. Like there have been groups of a huge amount of collective people coming together, trying to govern themselves, trying to, figure out direction and goals and projects and, coordinating at a really large scale, and how we could kind of learn from some of what they've done, whether that's, lessons in like communication and scaling and like polycentric governance. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things to learn. And yet at the same time, I think a lot of the problems that DAOs and co-ops have will kind of require some kind of common solutions, which is like trust is a common problem amongst all of those when you're trying to deal with human coordination at a large scale.
Yeah, completely. I think a not ideal reading of the paper would be that Web3 will solve all of the co-op problems that exist in the world. I think that just like isn't true. And I think really the goal of this work is to try and highlight the ways in which, yeah, as you said, sir, we can like learn from the history that DAOs can learn from the history of co-ops, and co-ops can kind of learn about some of the new technology that might be able to enhance the work that they've done over the past number of decades and centuries. I think when it comes to building trust, it is such a difficult thing to do in communities, but I think it's fundamentally like a very human thing. And I think governance is tricky. And as George was saying, there's like some cases where inequity makes sense governance wise in the early stages, like one person, one vote early on is a good way to like get nothing done. And I think issues that co-ops have had at scale is, you kind of start to have this committee problem of like every decision requires a committee, and then every committee needs like a bunch of subcommittees. And I think there are ways that like kind of democracy in that form can end up being slow. And I think what we've seen with DAOs is that there is some credence in some situations to kind of building stuff very quickly and breaking things along the way. And sometimes that's a good way to kind of emerge and see what works best. But yeah, all of these different sorts of governance models have so many different trade-offs. And I think there's just a giant need in my eyes for more case studies on things like Constitution DAO, things like all these sorts of experiments that have happened over the past few years in crypto.
Yeah, I want to sort of repeat what you said about this tech not being a panacea. So basically, the culture and the human issues are not going to be solved by the technology. It feels like it's even harder with platform cooperatives, because if you have a global base of users, stakeholders, then you don't have the inherent trust that comes from being a local business in the same community, where you have these repeat interactions and positive sum games. I think a lot of our trust issues across the internet come from the cultural and time zone challenges that come from being across the world from each other. Not to mention the sort of like phishing scams and like, things that happen across the global web, because we don't have trust across the web. So it actually feels like platform co-ops are higher stakes, and managing the culture and the people is a big part of it. And the tech is not a panacea. So just wanted to double click on that issue. That's a great point, Maxwell and Sarah. Next question. How do we codify these values so we can program our values into our money with Web3, at least in theory? But how do we codify the values that we're talking about in the paper into the organizations that we're building in Web3?
Yeah, I think there's a few different approaches that we can take to kind of codifying these values. I think the classic tried and true method is kind of creating a manifesto. I think in a lot of DAOs, we've seen this kind of work well of everyone collectively authors a manifesto or kind of this foundational piece of this foundational paper or a statement about why we're all here together. And I think we've seen that work well. In terms of more technical components to codifying values, I am still so optimistic about the ways in which we'll be able to codify values into our currencies with crypto. I think we've begun to see this with governance tokens for coordination amongst members of an organization. But I think we've still barely begun to scratch the iceberg in terms of what's possible with codifying values. I think experiments that we'd love to see happen, kind of building off this paper, are around what would it look like to kind of codify cooperative values, or for example, the Rochdale principles of kind of open membership and control and trade and participation and education into our tokens. And what would it look like if these tokens kind of upheld those values that we have versus kind of being the ends of speculation? I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think it is kind of at this point still a blank canvas in terms of what it looks like to codify values, but there's a lot of possibility. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I think another experiment we kind of mentioned in our discussions were kind of vice versa of how do we have maybe even some existing cooperatives who already have like a group of people who have really strong values and principles and are working on something together, and how can we have them maybe experiment or try some of these tools to help enable what they're doing better. And so that was like kind of another route that we took as well. And like in general, that would look like how do we make some of the tools we use today much more accessible? So right now, I think you need like a fair amount of technical literacy and like navigating this whole suite of different DAO tools. And so, somehow making these tools more accessible will help like adoption, especially by these existing organizations. And I think one quote that reminds me of is like, it's that one that's like, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so trying to figure out there's already groups that have these values and how can we help support them as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Sarah. And I think something I think about as well when it comes to adoption of kind of regenerative crypto economics is that a lot of people in the world and organizations who stand the most to benefit from some of these technologies just don't have like the privilege of spare time to like invest to like learn how to use like a crypto tool or like learn how to set up a wallet. I think a lot of these folks are so busy doing work on the ground that matters that it's just they don't have kind of the bandwidth to like learn how to be literate in crypto and Web3. And I think, a lot of things in crypto just kind of boil down to like the issue of identity and UX. And I think this is a great example of, hopefully I think in the next few years, we'll have a few leaps in what the UX for crypto is like, and we'll be able to have these tools be available to everyone who doesn't need to like basically, do the equivalent of like 100 hours of research to like become literate in it. They can just kind of pick it up and then use these tools to build, things that are specific to them.
It feels like, with corporations, we've had 200 or 300 years of evolution with what the corporate form looks like since the East India Corporation all the way to today, when there's a playbook for companies and there's an ecosystem of SaaS providers for them. And with DAOs, it's been like 3 or 5 years. I mean, a little bit more than that if you include MakerDAO. And just it's going to be a process of maturation so that we can speed run the history of finance and see what works and what doesn't. And then hopefully it'll be more accessible for anyone to create a platform co-op down the line once the trailblazers have figured out what works and unfortunately what doesn't work. One of the things that I thought was most fascinating about the paper was this idea of Elinor Ostram's 8 design principles for managing the commons and how they map to platform co-ops. So could you tell us a little bit about how we take Ostram's 8 principles for managing the commons and how those apply to platform co-ops?
Yeah, I can certainly give it a go. Elinor Ostram was a 20th century theorist, and she actually won the Nobel Prize for Economics for her work on the commons as a concept and an economic structure. And in her research, she proposed, let me back up and perhaps define what commons means briefly. So back in the day when there were sort of landlords and peasants and people who sort of looked after animals and needed land to run the animals on, the concept of a commons, a physical space, came into being where in a small group of humans, they'd have a space that could be shared amongst that group of humans in a common way, common land. And that common land was managed by that group of people. And you might have heard of a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons, which was written by a biologist in 1968. And basically, this Tragedy of the Commons paper declared that the commons will always fall apart because eventually somebody will take a part of that commons for themselves. And unfortunately, that paper's kind of impregnated everybody's opinions about the commons since the 60s. But Elinor Ostram, who came into the research world in sort of 80s, 90s, noughties, she kind of turned that on its head and said, actually, no, the commons needs to be managed by a group of independent humans who are all independent actors, and they can negotiate with each other quite healthily and amiably about the management of their shared resource. So she did all kinds of really interesting study in the physical realm about folks who, they might have managed the same fishing spot or a bridge that ran over a lake, or, these were local community groups where everybody knew each other. And she actually studied a whole bunch of these different groups ethnographically to try to find out the sorts of principles, the sort of design principles that these groups operated under in order to maintain harmony and, shared management of the shared resource. So today on the internet, you do have these concepts that call themselves the commons, but they're really missing that essential second piece, which is management by the people who use the shared resource. So in digital land, for example, in Flickr, which I'm working with, there's this thing called the commons, but basically it's just a bunch of free and legal to use imagery that's not actually managed by any of the institutions who put stuff into it. Anyway, so in our paper that's linked to about this article, we do list Eleanor Ostram's 8 design principles, and I'll just read a couple of them really quickly so you can get a feel for them. You need boundaries, not only about the commons itself, but also the group that runs it. You need to be able to make collective choices, and those choices and the dynamics to make those choices need to be arranged and sort of written out and agreed to, and also refreshed periodically. You need to also make sure that there's some way to resolve conflict if that happens within the group. So that's just 3 principles that are examples of the Ostram's 8 design principles. And she sort of universalized these based on meeting a whole bunch of folks who are running commons. And what we tried to do in the paper was map them to a very old set of principles that was started by a group called the Rochdale Collective in England over a century ago, I think it was. But this was a sort of a worker collective that ended up sort of providing all kinds of resources for the group itself. But so this group had an independent set of principles that did map pretty well onto Ostram's commons ideas. And what we tried to do in the paper is say, what we're missing is the additional sort of contextualization of things like this, principles like this in the DAO environment and the Web3 environment. So we were sort of saying in the paper, what can we take from these 2 sets of principles and apply now really actively in the DAO space? So, for example, of all the DAOs that we've been chatting about and all the project examples, can we point easily to them having a conflict resolution mechanism? And my guess would be probably not. But that's a very sort of central need for human groups, isn't it? Because if there's no way to sort of sort out what's going wrong, the group will just fall apart.
No, that was amazing, George. I think, thank you for that history. I think it's the through line as well with some of the Web3 components here, I think, is when we think about platforms and especially decentralized platforms and protocols, we can think of them as the commons. For example, I think there's an argument to be made that something like Uniswap is a commons, something like Lenster, for example, is a commons, these kind of open and permissionless platforms and protocols. And I think there's a lot of learning that, DAO contributors and people who build platforms and protocols can learn from the Ostram principles. I know at Gitcoin we were inspired by the Ostram principles when we were thinking about our governance structures, but I think it's been mainly aspirational. I think there's so much opportunity for builders in this space to reflect on the Rochdale principles, on the Ostram principles, and think about what does it mean to codify these values and these principles, and what does it mean to actually put them into practice. I think we've seen some small examples, but as you highlight, George, there's still a long way to go. And I think it's going to be an awesome journey to see different organizations experiment with ways that these values can be embedded from the outset and the foundation.
And one area we started with was just even recommending that DAOs look and learn from these principles, especially when as a group they come together to design and write their own constitution or, sets of principles for the organization to live by. And then that helps, at least on a, social way, help add some structure and guidance for the group.
I agree. I think it's going to be tricky to map those principles onto technologies, I think, contemporary technologies, I think, because, it's so very simple for a talented team or talented engineer to spring up a piece of software that, can take input and can have, lots of people using it very quickly. And for them, there's also, alongside that, the expectation that somebody out there will fund it, which is sort of the opposite of the Rochdale principles in particular, where, for example, it's expected that every member in the collective will also participate economically. And actually, I think that's almost insurmountable, based on the sort of mentality that we've grown over the last 20, 30 years of the internet to sort of, I'll just make a great piece of tech and then somebody's going to buy it, that kind of stuff. It's really different. So I think we've got to be careful that trust amongst humans doesn't scale like technology does. In fact, it just, if you scale things too quickly in a human group, it will disintegrate. So I think when folks are starting stuff with a good heart and lots of hope, before you reach out for a big wodge of investment, that's the time to look at these sorts of principles, to really think about how you can structure the work that you're doing and the group that you're trying to make sure that every member of the group is aware that it's a member of the group and how the group's supposed to be working. And that step's really hard to do well in tech because you sort of have to greet everybody. And that's also hard to do in tech. It's very sort of depersonalized in some ways. But you all probably know examples where it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah, that's a really...
autonomous is literally in the name, which is a bit, bit of a giveaway.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point as well, George. I think to double click on something you said, it's really hard to retroactively integrate these principles. Not that it's like too late if you're already big to like think about these principles, but I think the optimal way to integrate these principles is from the outset, like from the very beginning with like the core group of people, to really think about building these out, having these all present, and building these principles in a way that will hopefully scale, but they don't need to scale at the beginning. You can't really often integrate these principles when things are already at scale. I think that's when it gets choppy, when double standards, things like that begin to emerge. Yeah. So as much as possible, I think concretely and tactically, we might offer the advice to really begin with these principles from the outset.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. I think Eleanor Ostram's work has been so foundational, and I think that what you're doing here is foundational for a cooperative Web3 movement. So I've really enjoyed the conversation, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So maybe let's end by asking, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to say? And we can just go clockwise on my screen. Maybe Sarah, then Maxwell, then George.
Probably captured most of the comments that I was hoping to say, but maybe just end with, like, on an optimistic note. I think that there is, again, like, so much that DAOs can learn from this history of cooperatives and this whole collective action kind of movement, and so much that cooperatives can potentially learn and benefit from what DAOs are doing. And I think we should be really excited and optimistic about the future that we can create with these new tools, and with all the learnings of the history behind us and arming us to, build a more cooperative and collective organization. And I think in the end, my hope and my vision for the future is really that what DAOs are doing and what cooperatives are also doing, and by bolstering these kind of two groups up, we can actually genuinely have more equitably owned and governed organizations in the future. And so that makes me optimistic for what we're building.
Yeah, I am optimistic for the exact same reasons. I think my last statement here would be to please, if you're building an organization or thinking about creating a platform, please read the Ostram principles and the Rothschild principles and think about how you'll integrate them from the outset. I think something that Web3 has lacked, in my opinion, is just like an equity mindset, thinking about the ways in which we can build better systems for each other. I think sometimes we get caught up in coordination games and forget about the bigger picture. And I think as long as we can review these principles and try and let them guide us, I think we'll all go in the right direction. And I'm optimistic that we'll see lots of amazing and beautiful experimentation in this direction going forward.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. It doesn't have to be, a giant crypto Web3 situation that everybody has to learn how to use. And similarly, it doesn't just have to be, a green piece of park that you can go and run your dog on. But the skill will come when you can take what's happened in history, the things that have worked really well in history, and keep them in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
And, groups of humans are really good at governing themselves and have been for centuries now, so we don't have to chuck all that out. And that's why these principles might be good sort of spurs for everybody thinking about how they can make a more social technology. But yeah, don't chuck out everything that's happened before, because some of it really works well. But figure out how you can apply it to what you're doing so your tool is more social and more caring and more human.
Amazing. Well, I really enjoyed reading the paper. We'll have a link to the paper in the show notes. Definitely recommend that everyone check that out. And Sarah, Maxwell, George, thank you so much for giving a little taste of the paper. I think that it's a really important one. So encourage all the listeners to go check it out.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Peace and love, y'all.
Take care.
Thanks.